Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's masterclass, which is part of the Sign of the Times programme created in partnership with the University of York. This programme is supported by the Screen Industries Growth Network, hence Sign of the Times. This programme is produced by Lara Ratnaraja and Shirley Benson, and it aims to support and develop creatives from underrepresented backgrounds in creative businesses. This is our third webinar, and fantastic to welcome some of our regulars back and some new people who are here for today's session. My name's Helga Henry. For those of you who've not been on a webinar with us before, I'm a freelance arts consultant. I'm very interested in leadership in the cultural sector and the creative industries, especially around people from underrepresented backgrounds. And I'm really excited and pleased today to be joined by our third speaker in this programme. And tonight we have Joanna Geary, a really experienced technology executive who spent a number of years working on really mega communication brands, starting as a journalist in Birmingham, which is where I very first met her many, many years ago, working in the Birmingham Post, and then on to roles at the Times, the Guardian, and then nearly a decade, notably at Twitter, where she spent 9 years leading the global curation team. So, hello, Joanna, welcome.
Hi, Helga. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and just also to say a truly international edition today. I'm coming to you live from Cardiff. And Joanna is joining us from New York, so really fantastic to see you, and thanks for coming. Before Joanna and I get started, I'm just going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping. There are closed captions available as ever, and you get to them by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. There's an option there, you can view them as the full transcript or the sort of rolling transcript like you get for the news, only ours is much more accurate. I will be saying this a few times throughout the evening. There is an opportunity to put your questions to Joanna later, so please do put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. I think the other thing to say is, depending on the level of questions that accumulate as we speak, I will speak with Joanna for longer or shorter, so please don't save all your questions for the end. If you've got them, put them in the chat, and then I'll leave plenty of time to make sure we can get through them all. I think that's it for, and as ever, live on the chat, Shirley and Lara will be picking up your questions or fielding any queries and putting any useful links or something interesting that comes up in our conversation in the chat. So please feel free to engage with us through that medium as much as you like. So Joanna, hi, welcome.
Hello.
So let's get a few things out of the way first. I really want to, we're going to talk about a number of things that in the totality of your career. You spent 9 years at Twitter, but prior to that, you were the social and communities editor at the Guardian, digital development editor at the Guardian, and the community editor for the Times. So really, your home, your roots are very much in news and journalism. But you know, the interviewer in me says, let's get a few things out of the way first. If anybody has come here to find out about the new regime at Twitter or about Elon Musk, my guess is you're not really you can't really help them very much, can you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, to be a big disappointment, but my team was disbanded in the very first round of cuts that Elon did after acquiring the company. So I think in total of my almost 9 years at Twitter, I think I spent 2 weeks in Twitter 2.0.
Yeah.
Which didn't give me much time to learn much about the man or the company. So
no,
others spent more time.
Sorry, yeah.
Others spent more time. Yeah, and I think to be honest, the best story I've heard so far, or someone tell of the story of Twitter 2.0 in that transition is Yoel Roth, who is a close colleague of mine who run Trust and Safety. And he was on this American Life podcast this week or last week. It's called What I Was Thinking When We Were Sinking. And his interview came in about halfway through. And I would recommend, if people want something that is a take on that is not a hot take that you can find on Twitter, that's a great resource. I'll point them there, not to me. Maybe one day I'll write something.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it was a bit more Twitter 2.0 for you than Twitter 2.0, but
very good.
Sorry, dad jokes aside. But I think the point I would get out of that actually is timing. The timing of your career journey has been kind of really extraordinary. And I sort of mentioned obliquely, but when I very first met you, you were by no means an ordinary reporter, but you were a reporter in a provincial, highly regarded newspaper, you know, and not quite everything changed every night, but everything did change. So, yeah. Tell us, so in order to get a better perspective, tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, it's quite wild to look back on it. And with a lot of them, you know, after I moved into tech, and a lot of while I still had a lot of people who came from news on my team, I was working a lot more with people who had only been in tech, and often I would have to like explain, as a way of explaining just the journey I've been on. I would tell them, like, I started my career in the 1960s and ended up in like the 2040s. Is the best way to explain it, even though, of course, I didn't. But the amount of changes that happened, it's a way to help people understand that. So I became a trainee reporter at the Birmingham Post late 2004, having pretty much consistently wanted to be a journalist all my life. Right. I think different motivations, some of them more pure than others. The least pure was Dean Cain was amazing in New Adventures of Superman, and I just wanted to be Lois Lane.
Yeah, that is an admirable career goal, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, guys, don't knock it if you see a career on TV like that. Also, April O'Neil from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, pretty inspirational. But also just the idea of being able to tell people's stories who hadn't had the option or the opportunity to have their stories told before was always very powerful to me. And I remember getting the job at the Post, which I spent a long time trying to get. I remember the day I got it. 22, 23 years old, going, yes, I've made it. That's it now. I'm done. I've got here.
You're at a newspaper.
I'm at a newspaper. I've done it. I'm a newspaper reporter. All my career goals have been achieved in my early life. And, you know, I was handed, I was shown my desk, given my landline phone, and they pointed to the internet computer, which was the one in the corner of the room that you could share with the rest of the newsroom. There was conversation there at the time that the internet was fundamentally changing news in a once in a lifetime shift. Blogging had taken off. The New York Times had been online since the mid-90s. It had been started to become a more usual consumption pattern to get your news online. But then within 2 years, we were hit with like 2 more once in a lifetime changes with smartphones, the advent of smartphones and social media. And now we're faced with another once in a lifetime shift with the rise of ML and AI. So instead of one once in a lifetime change, we've overseen, we've been party to at least 4. In just one
tech lifetimes. Tech lifetime.
I feel pretty old at this point. And I think it gave me, I was really lucky. It gave me a really interesting and fulfilling career, connected me with incredible people that I've learned so much from, and taught me so much about leading and managing through different business cycles and change, right? Because I've had the opportunity to lead through times of incredible growth at Twitter, but also huge changes, structural changes that impact my team or impact the business as a whole. And when I look back into Joanna in 2004, who not, it was only about a couple of years before I was doing some of that change work myself, having sort of grasped onto social media and realizing the opportunity. I realized how much I've learned. I was a very, very enthusiastic, full of energy person, but I think I was far less aware about how frightening and difficult change could be for those whose careers just hadn't been defined by it. That's something I understand a lot more now, I think.
And you were saying an early motivation to you was something about accuracy and transparency in news. So I guess that's something that becomes a very live discussion when you start to talk about, I'm not even going to call it news and information, or the way information is used on social media platforms. So, tell us a little bit perhaps about verification. What was your role in, I know that you weren't in, you mentioned your colleague earlier who's just been on on NPR, being in risk and trust, but you still had a very strong role in sort of verification and how did that work really?
Got it. Yeah. So let me detour slightly and tell you a little bit of motivation of why I went into news. Because I think it was an unusual thing for a teenager or someone in their early 20s to do, because in the way I did, because I had thoroughly fallen out of love with the news when I entered it, and I still wanted to do it. And what I mean by falling out of love was I was a terrible tryhard at school and growing up, and I had kind of collected news working experiences as much as possible. One of them was a large newspaper that I probably won't mention. And I was work shadowing someone who was on the business desk, who I realized quite early on was mostly in it to get free products from the other businesses, that they were interviewing. I remember being utterly horrified and sitting down and talking to people about that. And the editor saying, sometimes people forget who they are and they think they're the brand, and they take advantage of the power that the brand gives them. And I was always really sickened by that and wanting to try and be a different person in the industry to that. Transparency and thoughtfulness and fairness were always something that I really cared about. They're really hard things to get right, obviously, throughout the whole arc of your career, but that was always something that was fundamental to me. So I think that explains one of the reasons why I ended up doing the work I did. And so curation morphed from a lot of things. It was originally just purely about content discovery on Twitter. How can we find fun, interesting, high-profile things for people to consume? And quickly, I began to realize that actually what was missing was the context and integrity to those conversations. So we had plenty of algorithmic ways for you to discover what was going on Twitter. What we didn't have was necessarily, those algorithms weren't as great at giving you the context or as great at giving you the reliable information around them. So what you ended up with was often people just clicking to Google because they didn't know what was going on, because the President of the United States was saying something about covfefe, but you wouldn't know what the context of that was, even though he said it on Twitter. So the work of my team was predominantly around that. And we touched almost every part of Twitter in a different way, where it made sense for human intervention to aid the algorithms that we had on the platform, whether that's through helping to identify misinformation, to making sure that when somebody trends on Twitter, it isn't because they died, it was just their birthday.
Or somebody had found a potato that looked a bit like that person. It's like so the other thing that your career has really marked, that you have overseen in that time, is a sort of real proliferation of information. We have perhaps opened the Pandora's box. Is there too much information? How did you well, first of all, actually, I'm going to just detour on the topic. 9 years ago, did you have any idea that it was going to get to be quite the cultural phenomenon it became. I know it was pretty big when you, even 9 years ago when you joined, but you know, it's just,
No,
you know,
I think by 9 years ago, yeah.
right.
I remember that it was so I was introduced to Twitter by a guy called Pete Ashton, who was working in the creative community in Birmingham. And I remember him saying, I haven't figured out what this platform is for yet, but it feels like it could be pretty useful. And I've got a feeling you might.
Yeah.
And so, and I remember that feeling of getting onto the platform and realizing that the stories that people were telling on there and the connections that I was making was so incredibly powerful. And the audience that I had felt that I was not connected to, the people of Birmingham I had felt like I was not connected to as a print reporter, because we had so many deadlines, we were so short-staffed. I suddenly started to connect with them, and I felt plugged into the community, which is always what news reporting is supposed to be about, right? Like, you're supposed to be of and serving the community, whether it's a specific topic or a population of people. And so I kind of knew that it was going to be important. At that point, I had no idea how much it was going to change and disrupt the path of news information. I just had no idea. And that has like, I think it wasn't until maybe 2009, 2010 when it became really evident how powerful it could be. And then like in 2010 to 11, how problematic that could be as well as positive. Sorry,
yes, and of course 9 years ago feels like such a long time ago, but actually it was 2014. So actually
2013,
2013, 2014. So actually it was quite established. But even so, how did Twitter and the work that you did in the team sort of change over time?
Well, so first of all, I didn't join to start in curation. I started in partnership management. Curation is still to this day something that I think most large social platforms have, but generally don't talk about or change the name of, or there's always some fuzziness to how people talk about the type of human intervention work that we do. But at the time I joined in partnerships, and I hadn't intended to join tech. I thought I was in my dream job, which was head of social and community at The Guardian. And Twitter approached me, small side. Every single job that I have got since the one at the Birmingham Post was offered to me via Twitter, apart from Twitter, who approached me via LinkedIn. So
that's brilliant.
So there you go.
Yeah. So
but I moved because I understood that there was the potential for this platform to have massive lasting effects on the news media. And I never regretted the move, because what it's changed in my life was I stopped advocating for technology in news organizations and started advocating for news and news principles at technology organizations. And that is much closer to my heart. News is my first love. Information integrity is my first love, not tech.
Yeah. And so moving those news principles into your work at Twitter, did that, I mean, we'll talk about you working with your teams and how that worked shortly, but was that about almost telling the tech people around you what news integrity was, how that worked, or what the mechanisms might be? What did it look, what did that look like?
Yeah, it's I was multifaceted,
faceted and fascinating. I'm sure.
And fascinating. Yes. I think news, along with many other information-based businesses and tasks, and I would widen this to information integrity, because I think by this point, when I was working in curation, it was larger than a narrow definition of news. It was about the quality and the integrity of the information that you had on the platform. Is one of those things where everybody thinks they could probably do it better.
Right.
Right. It doesn't matter who you are.
You've got an answer for this.
You probably got an answer for this. And I'll come back to if we talk a little bit about like democratic impact of all of this, like I'll come back again to it, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I think a lot of people will come in and be pretty sure that they know how things should be and how to do the better. But this is so complex. When you're talking about the elevation of information or news on a platform, there are so many different things to think about, whether it's like, who are you doing it for? What group of people are you doing this for? How are they going to react to it? Where do you see the information? How is that going to affect whether people interpret that this is reliable information or not reliable information? Like, it is the nuance, the cultural and language nuances that can happen on a highly scaled multilingual platform as well can be really highly complex. So a lot of it is just helping people to understand that there is no one truthometer that you can stick on a website or a context, one simple context algorithm. You can create algorithmic solutions to uplift context on a platform, but they are not, there is not one size fits all. You have to be very thoughtful and very deliberate about what the problem is you're trying to solve.
Right. And I think the minute, and also you start to figure out thoughtful, there's a time factor, isn't there? That part of the churn, both of news generally and now and news on platforms in particular, is that it's fast, isn't it? It's a very fast moving thing. So you haven't necessarily got the tools to sit there and consider everything and just let me just write a quick footnote to this so that everybody understands the full picture. It's just not possible, is it?
Right. It's fast and it's scaled. And people talk about the idea that journalism is the first draft of history. Well, if that history like took off on Twitter, then we were the first breath. We had to provide that sort of context before people were digging into it and understanding it. And that's a very skilled piece of work that you have to do in a very short period of time. And as you know, going back to that scaled and fast paced, it's not something that you can really expend just human work expertise on one thing at a time. So you have to start thinking about choosing what you spend your time on really carefully, and also looking at technologies that help you to scale that as fast as possible, which is where I think AI and ML, if I had been doing what I thought I was doing this year, that would have been a very exciting time for us, because I think we were seeing opportunities to really scale
to use those scales
when it came to that.
You touched there on some innovation and technology. Back when you were at the Post, something would happen on a day. You would pick up the landline, and sorry for young people in the call, a landline is like a mobile phone, only it was fixed to a certain position and it plugged into the wall with a cable. Just have to, you'd be amazed how many people really don't know what a landline is. And don't start me on whether your parents let you use it when you were a teenager to phone your friends. They did not. But so, there's a news cycle where something happens, you research it on your landline and, you type it up and it gets print sent and it's out the next day. The news cycle is, but also it was linear. So something might happen on a Monday and it goes into Tuesday's paper, and Wednesday there might be a bit more news about it, and so on. But that's all disrupted. Disrupted is barely the word, is it? That's just unrecognizable. So, and also we're all journalists now. We all wander around with our smartphones and we can film and we can tweet. Is it more democratic than it was now when you were the person who could or could not get something on the pages of a newspaper to what we have now? Is it more democratic now?
Wow. So that's a big question.
That's a
to try and answer in a short time.
That's very bad form as well, because it's a closed question. How might it be more democratic, or how might it not? I guess is.
Yeah. Okay. That I can work with. Yeah. So I think, and this is very much my own personal take, is that the tools that we have seen introduced in our lifetimes are unquestionably more democratic when it comes to information exchange. How could they not be?
Yeah.
So before the advent of the internet, the resources for the distribution of information were owned by a much smaller group of people.
Yeah.
And so you would either have to have a lot of resources or real sheer luck to be able to get your message out in the world in a way that there is a much lower barrier to today.
Yeah.
And so those that you heard from back then were more likely to be those who could afford to speak to you. And based on what we as citizens want from our societies, how we want to be, they weren't always the ones we wanted to be listening to necessarily.
Yeah.
Now, if you were to instead have asked me, does the democratization that these tools bring make it easier to maintain an effective fourth state in a democratic society? Let's put it that way. I'd say,
by the way, that sounds far too intelligent a question for me. But it's a very good one. I'm glad you asked.
Does democratizing a tool necessarily lead to more democratic, better democratic functioning?
Yeah.
Ooh, and then I'd be like, okay, that's a bit more chunky, right? I guess personally, I would still theoretically be yes, but with huge caveats, like it's highly conditional, right? So despite these tools giving us much more insight in the world, we're still reliant on others who have more experience in translating that information that's out there to us, unless it's something that we have direct experience of. And I think this is where I was talking earlier about the Dunning-Kruger response. I think this is where we suffer from that a lot, because we know a tiny bit of information about something. We might assume we're experts on the subject, and we are in reality largely unskilled to talk about it. So we think we understand.
And that's what the Dunning-Kruger response is. Sorry, I've not heard of that before.
Yeah, so the Dunning-Kruger is the idea that by acquiring when you acquire a small amount of information on something, you're more likely to more likely to believe you're an expert than if you acquire a larger amount of information on it.
Right. So the less you know, the more you think you know, as it were, and the more you know, the more you realize you've got loads to learn. Got you.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Much better put. And so and I think we see that effect quite a lot. Like we have access to way more information about many things, and ergo we assume we know more about them. And we actually live in a society where it's considered to be kind of like poor form to say you don't have an opinion on something.
True.
Whereas actually it would, we probably should
be very helpful. Yeah. Particularly in media. Particularly in the media, I think. Yeah.
And interestingly, as an aside, like one of these like defining things before I even knew about what the Dunning-Kruger effect was, when I was running community teams at The Guardian, we did a big survey of everyone who commented on Guardian articles, which I commissioned. It was such a failure, and I'll explain why. Because we had this hypothesis that The Guardian attracted these incredibly skilled people who commented on the website, and that we could utilize that and create more of eyewitness news type stuff or experts. And the whole exercise ended up being a lesson in survey design, because we asked people to self-report their expertise. And the results were that the average Guardian commentator believed that they were absolute experts in at least 4 major industry categories.
Okay. Right.
So from politics to science to environment, because they read the news, and so they believed they were experts.
They were experts, right? Yeah. Okay.
And so this is, I think, like we definitely have like an issue with understanding the limits of our ability to understand a problem. But that was a real aside.
No.
Going back to going back to needing people.
Yeah.
Sorry, Helga.
No, I was going to say that Baroness Cosgrove, that's not her name, but there was a Baroness who was the chair of Millwall Football Club, and they were looking for a new manager, and she got all these CVs in from men saying, I've taken Accrington Stanley from the Northern League to and we won the UEFA Cup in 2012. And they went, Accrington Stanley's never played it. They're barely a team anymore. And they were on their CV, they'd put their expertise on FIFA World Cup, on FIFA Manager. So they'd been playing on PlayStation, on FIFA European Manager, and they put that as their expertise for managing Millwall. So yes, that really doesn't surprise me. When actually most of those people's expertise is sitting on the computer and opining, haven't they? That's the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And for all of us, right? Like I want to level set it. I think like so much of this, the storylines and the narratives in digital innovation have always talked about one particular group or another just sitting in their underpants and making comments. And I actually think, we all need to be very self-aware that we're only really probably going to be an expert on one thing. Yeah. Maybe two, I don't know. And it's going to be narrow. And we absolutely rely on people to help us make sense of the information around us and that affects our life. Yeah. And we have huge challenges to making that happen with the democratization of tools, because the complexity of that work has increased, but the reward for that work hasn't. In fact, like it's not, not only is it not commensurate to the skill, but the reward hasn't actually been able to sustain businesses who are able to do that work. And some of the announcements that have recently happened with like the closure of BuzzFeed News and other organizations who say what you like about them, they were attempting to fund some of this type of work and found it very difficult to do so. So I think there is a lot of it's much harder to say that the tools right now necessarily have got us to a place where we're all expertly well informed on things that matter to us. I also, sorry, I know I'm opining a lot, but I think maybe another risk that I haven't mentioned is like how we operate these tools will ultimately affect whether they become more or less democratic over time, right? Right. So you see this in fears that are not altogether particularly nuanced in the way they're expressed, but the freedom of speech versus freedom of abuse. From abuse. Okay. We want to assure that most people are able to talk about their experiences on platforms, but in allowing this, we don't want to silence large numbers of people who should be heard, but go silent because a space feels dangerous to them. And that's, I think, going to always be an ongoing complex balance. So, I think the short answer is yes to the closed question. More democratic. But I think it's hard because it's putting pressure on those people who help us to make sense of our worlds. And there is a lot of bullshit out there. Right. Pardon my French.
No, sorry. Yes. Trigger warning for any of you bulls out there. Yes. So, and that moves me on nicely to, there is a lot of bullshit out there, and misinformation is a massive ongoing conversation. And it seems to me that a lot of, and it feels like it's a very new problem. But my sense is it's a very new problem because, there's relatively recent American presidents aside, it feels like, and to an extent, the Brexit debate here, it feels like large platforms, that shall remain nameless, have been tools like sausage machines churning out and delivering this misinformation to us. But I think you've got a sort of wider contextual take on that, haven't you? Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I mean, so down to the University of Birmingham and my English literature and history degree. One of the things that I think has always really helped me is to approach a lot of the problems that we face in technology with a reflection on historically what has been the case and how much tech is doing the disruption and where it's doing the disruption. Because ultimately you can't solve root causes until you really understand what is it that we have changed and how do we mitigate for that. So I actually I don't know if you've got it there, but there's someone who kind of level sets better than me, and I think I should leave it to them.
Yeah, so let's cue a clip that might help set that context. Gareth, over to you.
You're full of shit.
Language warning.
Wait, don't turn off. That was a terrible way to start a book. I'm sorry. I'm really not having a go at you in particular here, and that's especially true if you're listening to a bit of preview audio before you decide whether or not to buy the audiobook. You should. You're very wise, and also witty and stylish. To be clear, there's nothing about you especially that marks you out as being unusually untrustworthy or particularly given to falsehoods, unless you actually happen to be a professional con artist, I guess. In which case, hi, you might enjoy Chapter 5. You are, nonetheless, full of it. You're a liar, a bullshitter, and you're almost certainly wrong in hundreds of ways, large and small, about the world you live in. You shouldn't feel bad about that, though, because, and here's the important part, so is everyone else around you. And in the spirit of complete honesty, so am I. What I'm saying is simply that, as humans, we spend our everyday lives swimming in a sea of nonsense, half-truths and outright falsehoods. We lie and we are lied to. Our social lives rely on a steady stream of little white lies. We're routinely misled by politicians, the media, marketers and more. And the real problem with all of this is that it works. We're all suckers for a well-crafted fib. Perhaps the most pervasive lies of all are the ones we tell ourselves.
So,
yeah. So we all do.
I love
so really,
Tom's writing.
Yeah. So we all do it. And actually, I'm sorry, so to point at a platform and say it's the platform's fault is not really helpful.
Well, I don't know if that's the conclusion that I would take from it. So I'm not using it as a get out of jail free card at all. So I love Tom's writing. I would recommend that you read the book or buy the book. It's great. And he goes on to brilliantly show that despite it being fashionable for us to talk about us all living in a post-truth era, it's hard to conclude that that's what's happening because there is very little evidence anywhere in history of a truth era of which we are now post. Right? The people who have lied to us may change.
Yeah. Right.
The volume of it may change, and actually, what he's another thing he's incredibly good at, again, language warning, is identifying that there are numerous categories here that we have to think about. There is the lie, and it's something that a lot of people think about when they think about misinformation, is that someone is deliberately lying to me. Someone who already knows the truth is withholding it and deliberately lying.
Yeah.
And there is the much more pervasive, much more common, much more harmful in the long term, in some respects, bullshit, which is just people filling in the blanks of stuff they don't know with stuff they think should be real.
Right.
And he points to a certain US president as being a really good example of someone who uses that a lot or has used that a lot, not really caring whether it's true or false, just whatever necessarily fits the agenda. And as I say, I'm not saying this is a get out of jail free card for social platforms or indeed for news organizations. More, I want to start the problem or the thinking about the solution with the idea that there is no point in history where we as a species haven't used deception or bullshit to get through our daily lives. Yeah. And I think that, so the idea that a social media platform could cure that element that is essentially a human part of the human experience is not going to get you to a point where you solve the problem. What you have to start looking at is I think there's like two main areas which are really interesting to me. One is the ability for the amount of bullshit that's available. Like, I think the amount of flavors can increase rapidly once you have the internet. And then what is the responsibility of a platform to avoid providing additional exposure for that sort of information?
Right. Yeah.
And that is, And that is where you start to get into really complicated, difficult, nuanced discussions, because people, quite rightly, bristle at the idea that a platform is an arbiter of truth or an arbiter of what you should or shouldn't see. People get very worried about censorship. But at the same time, I think, and this is something that was popularized publicly by the current owner of Twitter, but is a phrase that has been used for some time. But there is this concept of freedom of speech without freedom of reach. And like we do actually, as platforms, need to take a position on what should be amplified and what shouldn't. Yeah. But once we get to that point, then it gets really, really hard, because it creates these very nuanced, stressful, and underappreciated jobs for people who work in platforms doing work such as trust and safety, moderation, and to a lesser degree, but still my team curation. Because ultimately, you have to take a judgment call at some point when what is your line and how do you cross it? And Twitter was actually really good, I think, at creating policies to try and guide people. But ultimately, these are very, very difficult things to guide people through. When you talk about prioritizing real world, prioritizing content or information that can cause real world harm, that still creates a judgment call. And because that's what we prioritize. The things that we could, seriously impact people's health or safety. But there's still judgment calls involved in that.
Yeah, because also sometimes it's almost like a triage, isn't it? You might have to be making a call as to there's several things that might cause harm, and now you're going to have to deal with the most harmful or the most impactful, and how do you calibrate that? In terms of depth or people, depth or people. Can you hurt a few people?
And how you
very profoundly, or can you pardon my French again, but piss off an entire generation? It's like, well, hang on, that's tricky.
Some of the smartest people that I have the most respect for in the tech industry are those people working in these arenas. They are largely disliked by anyone who doesn't work in them, because they are symbols to those people, but they are the most thoughtful, the most rigorous thinkers that I have come across in my career. And I think, even when you get to a point where you have drawn that line, how you develop a product that actually achieves what you want from that policy is another question again. So, for example, two products that sort of came out around 2020 on Twitter that my team was involved in. One was trend descriptions. So we talked about that, the idea that you add a description to trends. And, there were debates around whether that was too much, intervening too much. Right. Some people loved it. Some people hated it. They thought it was a name. I'm very proud that we became a meme. So Twitter description man is a meme on Know Your Meme. If you want to look it up. But what context provided in that circumstance, a very reactive circumstance. The trend had already happened. The conversation had already begun. It had reached that very high profile level of ending up in trends. By adding context into it, we reduced the toxicity of the tweets that came after by 40%. So they were far less likely to have abuse on them. There was less dogpiling. There was less moving into a space where abuse would happen because people had the context. What was harder to kind of get a good understanding of efficacy on was misinformation, dealing with misinformation. So the other area that we were involved in was, and I want to make clear, my team never decided on taking any action on any tweets on Twitter. That was trust and safety. But once action had been taken, then we would create context in a collection of tweets that would be available from the label that was placed on an account. So the highest profile on those was President Trump talking about election misinformation. We placed a label on his tweet, and that label linked to information that was provided by my team. And these reactive labels were something that a lot of people were clamoring for external to Twitter for some time. And every piece of data that we had suggested that they didn't really help.
Right.
And the reason they didn't really help, and that's unfair. Like I know that the PM of the labeling products would want to tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, that's not fair. There are many contexts in which they did help to some degree. So,
but in this specific,
they did help.
In this specific instance, they didn't help because of the nature
when
of
something is very divisive and everybody has a position already. All it does is reinforce someone's belief or undermine another group's trust in both Twitter, the company, and the sources that we link to. Because they see it as an attack on someone that they already support. So a lot of the work that we needed to start thinking about was how we interject into these really difficult situations where we know misinformation is going to happen. And the answer became, and we were exploring how we did this more, was something called pre-bunking, which is to use expertise to understand, but pre-bunk, to use expertise to understand what was likely to become misinformation and try and signal that ahead of that misinformation becoming high profile and entrenched.
Wow.
So
that's, that I can't, but what that's speaking to me, as you say that to me, is like, that absolutely goes back to those roots about accuracy of information and giving people tools, the tools. And now I haven't really thought about it, but yes, of course, if you are a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of anything, any theory of whatever, putting up a label that says, well, actually, here's some context, here's some counterfactuals, here's some anything. I'm reminded of that bit in Alan Bennett goes to see his mother and she says something outrageous, and he starts to give her the facts. She goes, oh, facts. You can prove anything with facts. Just this idea of like, if you don't like the message, just poo-poo the facts. It's like, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You would say that. That's just proving to me that he's in the right because you're persecuting him with these facts or whoever,
I remember this a day I don't feel like I did a particularly good job as a representative of my team with another team at Twitter, which was post the election, looking at all of this and looking deeply into like user research around it and how people had reacted to it and the data. And I remember very clearly there was a case study of someone who had come across a reactive fact check that had been part of a label around President Biden, who was just Biden at the time, or Vice President Biden, wearing an earpiece during a debate, which was debunked. And it was like, this is election information and we're providing election information to say this did not happen. And it was at a level where it probably, whether people believe that or not doesn't necessarily in the moment underline, it doesn't necessarily shake democracy necessarily. So maybe we shouldn't have done it. Maybe we should, I don't know. And I remember this video of this guy saying, I believe President Trump, I mistrust all mainstream media, and thanks to you, I now also mistrust the Associated Press because they were the ones that you promoted as saying he hadn't worn the wire. And I, of course, have decided he wore the wire. And I remember like getting to the point of just tearing my hair out and saying, if you think my job is to try and convince this guy that Biden didn't wear a wire, then I am in the wrong job and the wrong industry, because we do not have the tools to do that. That is not what we can do here. What we should be focused on is how do we stop people from going down into an information spiral that gets them to the point where they feel like that. And all of their information consumption is confirmation bias. And I think there are tools that platforms can use. And I think there is just ways that we have to be in society and how we think about information now that are going to have to change and aren't changing.
Just a quick call out for questions. I can see one or two just in the corner of my eyes sort of flashing up, but do feel, I've got a few more questions for Joanna, but do feel aimed and ready and poised to ask some questions within the chat or in the Q&A section. But just I want to move on in a moment because you mentioned your teams, and I want to hear about how you built your teams. But just before that, you touched on educating people really to know, to kind of have some literacy about, I suppose I'd call it information literacy, you know, to know about what they're seeing and being able to curate their own experience or their own context a little bit more. What in your experience is useful, what's good? You mentioned that there are some things platforms are doing, and what can people do? What you know, what are they doing, do you think?
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily your media literacy expert. So I'll keep it pretty high level. But I do think that, you know, if we go back to looking at the fundamental problem, we are not going to go back to a place where information is restricted, right? We might do. I mean, the information is restricted all around the world, but the technology allows people to put information out there, to a degree. And so we are now in a generative AI world where the speed at which that can happen is much shorter as well, or is much faster. So if we considered the problem to be infinite amounts of information on any topic that you could possibly want, you can get any answer you wish for. Like, how do we deal with that? Do we try and restrict that at the government level, at the global level? Like, how does this coordination work? And I think at the moment, a lot of our thinking has been, it has to happen at those sorts of levels. And I think there are some areas where we as societies, countries, nations will agree some things are totally unacceptable, and we'll work together and coordinate to make to say this is information we just do not want on any platforms. We've already seen evidence of that attempting to happen. Or not available on platforms or not promoted. I think the individual where I think we haven't quite got to the point where we've empowered individuals enough. So we give people media literacy training. We talk to them about being aware of their sources, what fake news looks like, so on and so forth. But if we are still giving them platforms where they can't control their experience in many ways, then we're not empowering them to take control of that themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And so a lot of the conversation prior to me leaving Twitter was really about that. And when you talk to people who have grown up with social media, because they are now literally adults, and it blows my mind that there's people who do not know a planet without social media. That's the message you get from them, is like, we do have relatively good understandings of media literacy. What we don't have is good controls. And I think that's an area that needs much more exploration, because right now you've either got no control whatsoever, or maybe you might find a deep and dark panel on your social media platform with 100 million different switches that you don't really understand what they do. And neither of those are a good option for people to actually just navigate information spaces effectively.
Yeah, certainly, yes, I agree. You mentioned your team earlier, and I'm going to wrap up shortly with a couple more questions, but I understand that your team at Twitter consistently scored much higher than average in terms of other project groups for morale. And so in terms of your experience, what do you think, how did you lead that team so that they had that good morale, and what did you, and where did you learn that from, I guess, is kind of,
I'd make a small factual correction. Well, now I come to think of it, I think it always scored highly on intent to stay and alignment with the mission of Twitter. And I think that's something that I feel like I did a relatively good job on. I was pretty good at being able to, because I had to do it for myself, right? I'm a mission-driven person, and I was staying at Twitter because I believed there was something that we could fundamentally do with our skill set that nobody else could. And so being able to highlight that in our strategy and our approaches and reinforce that and beat the drum for that and be passionate about it and show I was passionate about it, I think really helped. I have always, one of the big lessons that I learned later on, I think, was I think it's really common when you start taking on like larger leadership roles to feel like you have to always be really buttoned up. And really like know what you have to say to people, and reserve a lot of who you are. And thanks to my team who advocated for it, I started doing this like weekly half-an-hour Q&A chat, because we're very globally dispersed. We're very globally dispersed. And it would be like more of a lightweight, unstructured Q&As. It was the best thing to happen, because what happened was my personality broke out where I just can't, like, I got to tell them what's going on, but and tell them my thinking and give them the, like in my own, in my own words, give them the thinking of how we got there. That helped a lot. And it helped a lot to keep people focused on the mission. Morale was up and down. We did have huge sections of the team where morale was high for a long time. Morale would go down for lots of different reasons. One of the big reasons that was really, was something that was planned and was difficult, was the change in strategic direction from when we were just uplifting content on the platform. So we would have this great time, like, yes, we would do major breaking news, but we'd also uplift funny and sweet and things that people didn't really know about on the platform. Shine a light on a hidden corner of a nice bit of... which was often very, very wonderful. Couple of things that meant that I moved away from that. One was we would shine a light on some of these areas and then they would get abused. So like we were not in a place where we would do it. We were sophisticated enough to be able to, as a platform, protect these people, and that did not feel right. And secondly, we just had so many things that were uplifted that lacked context, and they were not uplifted by us. So we would uplift lovely things and they would be like, they'd have the full context around them and you could read the story, and we would spend a long time putting them together. And then there'd be like, I don't know, like some hashtag that would go around and it would be a mess, right? And so ultimately, if we want to serve the customers with the product we have today, it was to focus on the way the product worked today, not to try and circumvent it with human intervention. And then once we do that, we have to try and figure out ways to scale it, because as you know, when we were in that era where we were hiring experts to look at content, there were questions about, when do we stop? Like, do we need to get someone for every country, like a couple of people for every country on the planet? Like, was I going to run the BBC effectively in terms of headcount? No, never. Like that was never going to be able to be sustainable for Twitter. So what could we do now that, even though it was worse than what we could do by hand, could be automated? And that was the area where we started to investigate human in the loop machine learning. And we were seeing some really interesting results towards the end of last year, which I really wish we could have kept pushing on.
Well, that might be where I, because obviously just with that's very in the news right now with more consumer-based tools like ChatGPT, and you saying that was something that you were hoping to be able to get, but where now that you're on the outside, where do you see that going? Where do you see what's that into? So you've got, because there's problems with misinformation on ChatGPT as well. I got it to write a review of the work of Helga Henry, which was just like a way of playing about with it, and it mentioned my book, Being Human: Thoughts and Notes on Diversity and Inclusion. I went, well, that's good. And I actually then went on to Google to see if somebody called Helga Henry had actually written that book, because I hadn't. But like ChatGPT gave me this book I'd written. It's just like, it's crazy.
You need to manifest it, Helga.
I know. I think well, that's now. Of course, now I have to make it so. So I'll be off in about 10 minutes. No, but so now we have the human propensity to bullshit, and we also appear to have machine learning propensity to bullshit. So
well, machine learning is only learning from humans, so
yes, I guess, yes. So yeah, to the power of, yes. So what are your, what are your thoughts about where this not might end, but what's the next phase, challenge? Yeah,
I tell you, it's something that I'm doing a lot of talking to people about at the moment. I actually see, I talked to people about, I didn't move to New York, I just moved to another Twitter office when I moved in 2016. I didn't really see much of the country because I was so involved in the work, and having this time now is been a really wonderful opportunity as things change to start talking to other people about where they see this. And I don't have fully formed thoughts about where I want to jump to and the part of the problem that I want to solve, but I do see there being interesting things that will happen spurred on by government legislation or like regulation. I think that will spawn a business incentive for different types of technology that currently there's no business incentive for at the moment. Whether those will all be wholly good or not is definitely up for debate, but I think there is certainly a gap in the market that hasn't really been filled yet because there isn't really a business need.
Right.
But these platforms are really hungry for outside innovation that helps them to address this at scale, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, if I could hear, like, if I could have had a pound for every time someone said, wouldn't it be nice if we could just import information about the transparency practices of every news organization in the world? You'd be like, yes, but that doesn't exist. And where it does, it's like we don't, it's not in a format that we could use. So I think that there's probably going to be more business use behind some of those types of technologies. I do think more control into the hands of users is going to happen. I also believe that we as I think this is the last generation that's going to kind of have that news compulsion where they feel like whenever something is news, they need to consume it.
Right. Yeah.
I think we have now reached a full-on saturation point with that, and that people are going to become I think people are just, for their own sanity and ability to get on with other parts of life, are going to have to be more discerning about what they choose to consume and when. And I think we need to move away from placing judgments on people who choose not to consume certain types of news, and instead kind of develop principles and frameworks that make sense for people so that they can communicate, like, I deliberately choose not to go down this area because I don't believe that it impacts my health, wealth, and happiness to the degree that XYZ does. I think we all have to end up with those principles in some degree, and then have the tools in order to enact that.
Yes, I'm trying to. That's right. Have you ever read a guy called Rolf Dobelli? I think his name is. I'm almost ROLF Dobelli, who's like, why I don't read the news, and he says that news is like sugar, like we consume it and it gets us all hopped up. And he said, and there might be lots and lots of news about that a bridge fell down, and there's but then at no point does anybody stop and go, well, why did the bridge fall down? That's the news. That it fell down is one thing, but
and how many other bridges is that likely to impact?
Yes, right. I mean, we can't go there because of time, but this is all the way through the pandemic when people said X number of people died today. I'd always want to go, but how many people die on a Tuesday not in the pandemic? I might be, they just give you a blank number, and I'd go, well, I need context for that number.
Context, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's 36 people. 36 people died in the UK last week. Well, I don't know. That sounds like a lot of people, but how many people die every week in the country? I don't know. If it's only 3,000, then that's really worrying. If it's about 33,000, then it's not nice, particularly for the extra 3,000 people, but it's a very different proposition. But yeah.
And I think that context provision is the area that I'm starting to get really interested in.
Yeah.
So for example, one of the things that I've had a brush with the US medical industry over the last couple of years, and I've done a lot of my own research on certain types of medical conditions. It's very, very hard to navigate as a layperson. Different types of papers, different ways that papers, like different conditions and different names and drugs. And I think there is like real opportunity within a generative AI, with AI, to provide people with tools that give context for those sorts of things. How can you provide people with the sort of the Sparks Note companion guide for some of the things that they are experiencing online, not necessarily telling them if it's true or false, which I think people have tried to, but instead trying to give them the context of where this information came from and why it came from.
I have a luckily not very serious at the moment, but I have an ongoing medical condition, and one of the first things I was told was, don't read about this on the internet except for the NHS site, because what you'll do is you'll get it's a condition called sarcoidosis. It can be very, very severe, or it can be quite mild. But if it's very severe, you are looking at the heart and lung transplant sort of category. And she said, my experience is that it's only the people who are very poorly, lots of time on their hands, who write about this stuff online. Everyone else is kind of getting on with their life. And so you get a very, you get a biased, or you don't get the full range of the experience. Not a lot of people are saying, well, actually, I've got it and I'm fine, and I've just gone to work today. You're getting the people who are, and I don't want to knock it. These people are getting a lot of support, and it's very cathartic, but it isn't presenting an overall picture like you're talking about. I'm going to move to questions. Sorry, we could talk a bit more, but I'm really conscious that I want to get some. We have had some questions. The first is from David Firmage. Hello.
Hi, David. One of my first bosses in Birmingham.
I was just about to say, I think you might know him. But so David says, how quickly are we going to get some kind of non-erasable watermark in images that can act as a verification that the image is genuine and not been manipulated or created by AI?
I mean, that is certainly something that people are looking into. There are a lot of distributed technologies at the moment that are looking into watermark or some sort of ledger for understanding if something has been taken. There's a really interesting small business in the UK, and the name escapes me, that's actually creating hardware, like actual photographers for news organizations that build this in as they take pictures. I'll need to try and dig that out and find it for you. So I don't think it's very far away. I think what might be further away is adoption.
How do you mean?
Well, in that it does actually need to be at the point of the picture for that to happen.
Have to use it.
Like, so it's going to have people. It's going to have to be in smartphones. It's going to have to be in certain places, and then also what you're going to have to do is incentivize people not to erase it. So, for example, there is metadata associated with pictures when they're taken, time that they're taken, sometimes location of where they're taken, and that is erased when you upload it to Twitter at the moment for privacy reasons.
Right.
So there are competing issues within that space that makes maybe adoption harder. So I don't know. I'm not in the business of predicting timelines, because anyone who confidently predicts things seems to be wrong. But I would say, like, I think the technology is kind of there. It's just really about adoption now.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Next question from Jamie. Joanna, how would you respond to the statement? I might have to read this twice. It's quite a complex question. How would you respond to the statement that in the UK, the last few decades have shown the steepest decline in trust in the media globally, second only to Egypt? Their references from Novara Media, and the question is, how do you think we got there? So I'll just say that again. So in the UK,
Gosh, that's like, isn't that a history book somewhere someone should write?
yeah, why the steep decline in global, well, in global media.
Well, that was not global media. That question was specific to the UK, right?
Yes.
UK media.
So in the UK, yes, in the UK, the last few decades have shown the steepest decline in trust in the media globally, second only to Egypt. Oh, I think maybe the sample was global. Sorry, that's why I've not read it very well. How do you think we got there?
So, sorry, it's globally people distrust, but people distrust UK media.
I'm sorry.
I might need a clarification.
I'm just reading the question. Yeah, so Jamie, if you want to get back on that, clarify that. I'm literally reading it as written. How would you respond to the statement? So in the UK, the last few decades have shown the steepest decline in trust in the media globally, second only to Egypt. But I think they meant of all the countries in the world, Egypt trusts the media least, and the UK trusts it second least. That's what it means.
Got it.
That, yes, and
don't think I'm the best person to answer that question. Thank you, Jamie, for confirming. And then you'll hate me, but I'm not going to be the best person to answer that question because I have not been as engaged with what's been happening in the UK as much since 2015 when I moved to the States as perhaps I should be to be able to answer that question. I think there is I think in talking more general terms, like their trust is eroded when alternative narratives can be found for good or for ill, and certainly the availability of those for every country, almost every country, who doesn't very, very heavily censor their internet has become available. And I think maybe there are, this would be my very personal guess, very specific events that have happened in terms of political decisions that have happened in the UK that may have meant that politically leaning publications may have egg on their face and look like they lied to their readers to a significant degree.
Well, also, and there have been scandals. There have been, phone hacking.
Right.
There's been, I think, even all those years on. Things like Hillsborough, the reporting around Hillsborough, and that finally, it taking 25 years, 30 years, what am I saying? 30 years for an apology to be issued. I know that was about the police giving a full story to the media, but also that the media played along with that story for many, many years. And it's only a few active citizens and a handful of journalists who were plugging away at the truth that finally came out. So I think this is a huge aside, and this is just a reckon. So I really want to baseline it as a reckon. But something I've noticed being a transplant from the UK to the US is that the UK really believes in fair play. Against all the odds, the UK really expects fair play from the people in power, and I love the country for it. But it means that something like Partygate can exist, whereas everyone here would just assume that abuse of power would be going on, right? This is not
in the
news.
US. It wouldn't have made a headline. This would have been like a tiny nib somewhere in a paper. It's just like, of course, they were having parties when they said everyone else shouldn't. But in the UK, it can be a major contributing factor to the firing of a prime minister and the downfall of a prime minister. And I think that that's really interesting. And I'm sure that comes to play here in how that affects trust between the citizenry and the publications that are, still to this day, very party aligned.
Yeah, and institutional. Another question, this time from Gareth. And again, I'm caveat because you are in New York and you have been there for a while, so I don't know how on top of this you are, and I'm certainly not, and I live here. What is Joanna's opinion on the new online safety bill that is being currently proposed by the UK government? Again, you may know more about that than I.
I don't know the details of it. I've seen, and having talked to everyone about the Dunning-Kruger effect, I did read part of an article about it on Twitter, which I could use to expound a point of view, but then I would be doing exactly what I told everyone that I shouldn't do. I'm gonna
pass on
I'm going to
that.
sustain. I'm interested to learn more about it, and I will go and learn more about it after this.
Yeah. So again, still going to call out for questions, and if not, I'll wrap up quite shortly. But I suppose one of the things that Sign of the Times has been looking in this series of conversations is, and it might be a little bit unfair to drop this on you, but some sort of, we've got students, we've got people who are looking to build their career in the media, in particular looking to build their career in terms of content creation, however that might be. What would your sort of top tips, 2 or 3 top tips to somebody setting out now to navigate that, or to think about, that might be helpful to them?
So I think I haven't been asked this for a long time. And my perspective of where I am today means that I'm probably not as clued in as when I was a Cup reporter starting to develop my career in this space. Yeah. But one thing that I have noticed is that if you're talking about media creation or news or someone in the content creation industry, I think 5-6 years ago would be like, be out there and just keep putting your work out. And I think there's still an element of that to this day. But I think what's really important now is to be more sophisticated about who's seeing your work and why they're seeing your work and what they need from it. Like, I think there was a proliferation of people just putting stuff out. And the thing is, there's so much stuff. There is stuff coming out of everywhere. What we need is, as I go back to, context about stuff or connection. We want to feel connected to particular communities or spaces or ideas. Like, I think having a really good sense of who you're trying to reach and why is really important. I think we're going to see another amazing emergence of community-led products as people start to realize that they don't want to be treated as like eyeballs to a sort of mass experience, and people are going to be looking for those spaces where connection can happen. And I think having a good sense of that and acting a bit more like a product manager as opposed to someone who just likes pushing out content, really considering what is it that the product that you want to really try and build for people, and then putting stuff out there and trying it and testing it and failing and learning from that becomes good. But then you've actually got a North Star that you're trying to work for, something that you want to try and achieve for other people, not just audience for yourself.
And that's interesting, because we've had other speakers who've talked about put yourself out there, but it isn't, as you say, there is already so much stuff out there. I think the AI point is that increasingly the authenticity and the authenticity of self, that's the thing that's going to make, is this a bot? No, it's not a bot. It's Helga, because I know, because she's used a quirky word, or she's been herself, and that isn't an algorithm. I think there's something about that.
I was never any good at writing as the print journalist. Like, it was my least favorite thing about journalism. And every single post that I made on my blog was terrible from a writing perspective. It wasn't what led to things working for me was the connections I could make with people, the way that I would talk, the non-judgmental spaces that I could sometimes create. And I think that was much stronger as a skill for developing my career than just being able to write nicely and put it out. Some people can write so well that it does it all on its own, but not everyone, and I'm not one of those people.
It's interesting, but Yara was also talking about your networks, your connections, so making those both personal and cognitive connections and linking those things up clearly sound important. final question before we wrap up is it possible to, is it possible to increase the inclusion of underrepresented groups in a wider way, in authentic news and information sharing? So there is a lot of stories out there, but is there something that people from underrepresented groups can do, to get those previously not untold but unheard stories, unlistened to stories out there?
I mean, this was something that we concerned ourselves with a lot within my team and with Twitter generally, and Twitter 1.0. I'm not sure how much it's a priority now. And certainly we had developed a series of different initiatives aimed at exactly that, to help us to keep track of our curation and the diversity of voices that we're using in curation. And because it's very easy when you're curating, you're just trying to get context to people in a short amount of time. So, and it just so happens that the same 3 news organizations are very good at tweeting very quickly. So then they get included, and then you're like, okay, we have a real paucity of sources that we're using here. So we spent a lot of time widening our source base, going and vetting sources to increase that diversity. And we had a lot of we had councils and committees that were external that would advise us on how we increase that. Sorry, that's my doorbell if anyone can hear it. Yes. And I think that's something that was really, really useful at the time. I think, again, it's about, I think I'm getting to the point where I need to not talk, because this is out of my area of expertise these days. My work was always about how to take things that already exist and compelling stories that already exist, and take them to a wider audience because they provide context. Perhaps that's the best advice I can give. The more context you can provide people to help them understand an experience that they haven't necessarily had before in a non-combative way, that becomes something that can travel really far, or at least in the experience of the work that I was doing, could travel really far.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we're going to be wrapping up now, but Joanna, it's been really fascinating. It is just, I think it's so easy for us to think that, we all carry our phones around, we all glance at Twitter, it's how hard is it? It's just it's a bit of a website, isn't it? But actually all that, just letting us peek behind the curtain at all the thoughts, I'm just really left with a sense of the responsibility that you convey about, was that with great power comes great responsibility. But I really have a sense of that great responsibility that certainly that you've shared with us about your time. And I know we can't talk about the future, but that's been a real privilege, and I really want to thank you for that. And good luck. I really want to know what Joanna does next. And I know there isn't and I know there isn't a Birmingham Post anymore, but we'd have you back. You could come back, find something to do.
I'd love that.
Yeah. Well, although I think I'd also love to join you in I'd love to I think I'd love to join you in New York more than you'd necessarily love to come back here. But anyway, so thanks so much. It's been a real privilege, and thank you. Don't forget, I noticed that Lara's just shared the YouTube video of our previous masterclass. These masterclasses are ultimately available online, so use them as a resource. Tell your friends and family. They're a fantastic way of just having an amazing snapshot of what's going on in content creation right now. That's thanks to our program curator Lara Ratnaraja, who has pulled this program together, our producer Shirley Benson, our tech producer making it all look lovely and making those fantastic stings and everything is Gareth Peel, and capturing every single word that we say, including if I say something random like Frankfurter, and it'll be on the closed captions. Doing all that fantastic closed captioning work is Wendy Osmond. So the dream team as ever. There's one final masterclass to come, again in about a month. That's on a Monday, 22nd of May. So keep an eye on the Hello Culture website or follow us on Twitter. Other platforms are available, but I don't know what they are. Or sign up to our mailing list if you're not already. A big thanks to Sign for the Screen Industries Growth Network. Big thanks to them for the funding the programme, and in particular to Pip Brackstraw for her support. So enjoy. So Joanna, you've got the rest of your day. Everyone else, enjoy the rest of your evening. Bahadar from Wales, from me. Good evening, Joanna, and thanks. Have a great evening, everyone. That's all there is time for this time. Take care and hopefully see you next time. Joanna, hang on up behind the scenes and we'll just say goodbye. Thank you all very much. See you again soon. Bye-bye.